as I'm recording this, or whenever you're watching it, a good time of whatever the time is. Now, as we look at today's reading for March 13th, we encounter Numbers 19 through 20, and it's a good spot to look at the overarching saga of both Exodus and Numbers. You might have noticed that certain things repeat, and that's not an accident. So, as we look at this, we see that here we have a set of three different cycles going on throughout Exodus and Numbers. In Exodus 10, we see, or actually in Numbers 20, sorry about that, we begin with a brief report of Miriam's death. And so I'm going to start over. I messed up there. So it's actually, I think, chapter 19 that we see a report of Miriam's death. And then that marks the beginning of the third and last travel narrative in Exodus Numbers. That's what I was trying to say all along. So the first travel narrative deals with the journey from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, and that's Exodus 13 through 19. Then the second travel narrative deals with the journey from Sinai to Kadesh, and that is Numbers 11 and 12. And the third and final travel saga, the narrative, summarizes the journey from Kadesh to the Transjordan, just across the Jordan River from the Promised Land. So, as we look at these different travel narratives, they all have similar motifs or themes or things that happen over and over again. For example, battles with enemies. That is a repeated thing. Complaints about the lack of food and water and the miraculous provision by God of food and water. That's another thing that we see over and over again. And the need for faith and the role of Moses and Miriam and Aaron as leaders and so forth. These things repeat. But each of these travel narratives develops quite differently. So the first one begins with the defeat of the Egyptians, and Moses and Miriam sing songs of triumph by the Red Sea, and the people believe the Lord and his servant Moses, and everything seems great. But then the mood changes all of a sudden, and the people are complaining about the lack of food and water. So it starts out great and then isn't so great. Then the second travel narrative is one that also starts out very well. It begins with the cloud of fire leading the people forth from the mountain of Sinai to the promised land. But then, by the end of it, we see the grumbling of the people and the grumbling of Miriam and the disheartening report of the spies and the postponement of the conquest of the promised land and the defeat of the Israelites by the Canaanites at Hormah. So that travel narrative starts out well and ends not so well. But here we are, and the third journey, already you notice it's something quite different. As it begins on a note of gloom and then ends on a note of subdued but real jubilation. We see as this travel narrative starts out here in chapter 20 that we have the death of Miriam, we have the unbelief of Moses, and we see that he's shut out of Canaan. This is followed, however, by victory at Hormah in chapter 21, and further victories over Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, and there are songs of celebration reminiscent of the songs of victory earlier by the Red Sea. Therefore, this final travel narrative that we have reverses the pattern that we see in the first and second travel narrative. Tragedy now ends in triumph and reawakened hope of being able to enter into the promised land. Just as the regulations laid down in chapter 19 point to Jesus, whose blood cleanses us from all our sin and gives us forgiveness, so also the big picture of Exodus and Numbers points us to the even bigger picture of Jesus' seeming defeat on the cross, ending up as the victory that he won for us, conquering all our foes of sin, death, and Satan, and giving us hope such as can only be found in him. Well, sorry about that whole mess with Miriam's death. I think it really is in chapter 20, come to think of it. But you get the idea how God is a God who brings great reversals into our lives. And when we think all is lost, he is able to give us hope. So hang on to that hope. God's blessings to you, and we'll